These are Russian soldiers. They're protesting against the Russian government because they haven't been paid what they were promised for fighting this war. This is a symptom of a bigger problem that Vladimir Putin is facing. Russia's economy is dying, and it's all because of the war that Putin started. The famous saying is true: no one wins in a war. Just because Europe is struggling, that doesn't mean Russia is any better off. In fact, as you will soon see, Russia might be very close to collapsing in on itself, and it's all playing out right in front of us. Sanctions are pushing the Russian economy down a dangerous path, and the invasion is costing Russia its entire future. According to Russia's own central bank, Russia is set for the deepest recession of any large economy this year. So in today's video, let's go over how bad of a situation the Russian economy is facing, and how long can Putin afford to continue his senseless invasion.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
After months of preparations, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine. Speaking on national television, Mr. Putin urged Ukrainian troops to lay down their arms and go home.
We can see the Ukrainian forces exerting a very comprehensive push across the whole territory.
Ukraine's army has said it made major gains around the port city of Kherson following Russia's announcement that its troops were withdrawing from the area.
Jubilation in the streets as Ukrainian soldiers retook the strategic city of Kherson after Russian forces retreated.
First, let me address the elephant in the comments. I know everyone predicted that Russia's economy would collapse when sanctions were first announced. But looking back, it didn't. So what happened there? Well, Russia's economy did hurt initially from sanctions, but it had its oil and gas industry to depend upon to make up for any loss. We'll go into more detail about this soon, but as oil prices rose, Russia made more money, and the economy survived because of that. But now oil prices are slowly coming down, and other countries are getting less dependent on Russian oil, so things are not looking good for the Russian economy. Let's get into what problems it's facing. But first, let's back up a little bit and start from the beginning. As soon as Putin launched his invasion in Ukraine, Russia was hit with sanction packages that were probably quicker and heavier than anyone expected. Overnight, Russia was cut off from the global economy, and foreign businesses left the country, leaving behind billions of dollars in investments, all to show their protest against the war. Globalization, the thing that helped every country get wealthier and wealthier, was now being used against Russia because it threatened world peace. We were reminded that no matter how dependent countries are on each other, it could all go away in the blink of an eye. Or at least, that's what the media made it out to be. It was predicted that Russia would lose 15% of its economic output in just 1 year because of these strict sanctions. The sanctions included a freeze on Russia's foreign reserves, restrictions on critical supplies it got from trade, blocking oligarchs' access to the world, and much more. As bad as all that sounds, things didn't quite work out as predicted, at least when looking from the outside. The Russian ruble dropped at the beginning of the war, but it quickly recovered and climbed higher than the pre-war level. The 15% drop in the Russian economy was revised to 7%, then 5%, then 4%. And instead of the Russian economy crashing, the news cycle was overtaken by European nations' economies struggling because of countermeasures taken by Russia. So, just to recap, Russia launched a war. Other superpowers didn't want to get involved directly and risk nuclear escalation, so they sanctioned Russia into oblivion. And the countries that ended up struggling from the sanctions were the— Let's address something that's been on my mind before we move forward. After watching my videos or other YouTubers' videos, I'm sure some of you guys have thought about starting your own channel. One of the biggest hurdles people face when starting a YouTube channel is that they are not comfortable showing their face in videos. Not everyone wants to give up their privacy and be in the public eye all the time. That's one of the big reasons why our videos are made in a documentary style. The craziest part is, people still love the videos, as you can see from the fact that we recently crossed 1 million subscribers. In fact, there are millions of faceless YouTube channels making content and earning ad revenue. In just the last 3 years, YouTube has paid out $70 billion to creators. That's around $60 million every single day. So if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, right now is the perfect time. That's why we've launched a completely free 7-day email crash course on how to start and grow a faceless YouTube channel. If that's something you're interested in, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. All right, now let's get back to the topic at hand.
Massive and targeted sanctions. We will target strategic sectors of the Russian economy by blocking their access to technologies and markets that are key for Russia.
Sixth package of sanctions against Moscow over its war on Ukraine and called for a phased embargo of Russian oil imports by the end of the year.
The Biden administration's plans for sanctioning Russia are taking shape. U.S. institutions would be prohibited from dealing with major Russian banks and state companies.
This was a direct and debilitating hit on the Russian economy. The removal of Russian banks from the SWIFT financial network and the sanctioning of the Russian central bank are unprecedented in their impact, and they're sending Russia back to the 20th century in terms of its financial standing.
Yeah, quite right. The ruble has sunk to another record low.
His announcement last week sparked an exodus of Russians fleeing across the border into Georgia, Finland, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and elsewhere to avoid being conscripted.
You see, it would be unfair to say the sanctions didn't work. Russia has no access to microchips, which severely hinders its capability to fight a modern war. Its car industry is dead because of the sanctions. The aviation industry was pushed back decades because important equipment are not arriving from Europe and the US. Inflation is currently at 12% in Russia because of the shortages in essential goods, all while the central bank is cutting interest rates to fight off the recession. So if everything is going down the gutters, how is Russia continuing the war? Well, oil and gas. Since 2017, Russia has been building its war chest to prepare for a situation like this. On top of that, as soon as the invasion was launched, oil prices shot up to the highest level this year, and they have stayed relatively high for a good part of the year. This helped Russia generate a record amount of revenue and keep funding its economy and the war. Record oil prices and the inelasticity of oil demand helped offset a lot of the drag down from the sanctions. Russia made $100 billion from fuel exports in the first 100 days after the invasion, which was up 60% from the same time in the previous year. And it made more money while exporting less oil, all thanks to higher prices. Europe was one of Russia's biggest customers, and has been slow to stop their imports, as it's a necessary resource and hard to replace quickly. Whatever revenue Russia lost from the United States was easily made up by increased purchases from India and China, but, at discounted prices. India and China realized that Russia needed to sell oil, and they took advantage of the situation to get it at 30% cheaper than market prices. Russia didn't mind the discount because oil prices were much higher than this time last year, so they can afford to give a little discount on an already raised price. But as the panic around oil demand slowly goes down, the prices are more likely to come down, given that OPEC doesn't help Russia too by continuing to cut supply. As this happens, Russia's revenue will also slow down, hurting the economy even more. We are already seeing signs of this happening. As exports to the EU fell, it was assumed that India and China would make up this demand. But as Russia is trying to decrease the discounts on prices, the demand from China and India is also decreasing. Europe is planning to stop buying Russian oil in December, which would be a huge dent in Russian fuel revenues. It's also predicted that Russia will likely run out of its reserves by the end of 2023, making it even harder to fund a war. That's why Western countries are also trying to introduce a price cap on Russian oil, so that Russia doesn't continue benefiting from high oil prices, and countries that need Russian oil can continue to get it. Details of this price cap are not yet set, but one likely scenario to convince other countries is, well, it's kind of aggressive. Let me explain. how can you convince countries like India or China to follow price caps set by Western nations? It's a bit hard. So one solution is threatening the country with sanctions if they don't follow these price caps, which is unlikely to help any of your relationships. So it's been reported that Biden isn't really considering this approach. Another strategy being considered is to apply an oil price cap using insurance companies, which are crucial to the shipping industry. Most of the oil around the world is shipped through the oceans, and these ships need insurance to set sail. It's a law, and it's required by ports if you want to dock. Around 90% of the insurance market is controlled by Europe and the USA. This gives them huge leverage. So to enforce a price cap, insurance companies would only insure a ship if the price of the oil on board doesn't exceed a price cap, which means if Russia wants to sell the oil, it needs to follow the price cap, which will reduce their top-line revenue. Other than oil, gas is also a big part of Russia's revenue stream. Gas is mainly transported through pipelines, which takes decades to construct. So as European countries cut their gas purchases from Russia, it's getting harder for Russia to find new buyers. And it's near impossible to supply gas at scale without building the infrastructure first. If Europe ever gets to a point where it doesn't need Russian gas, the consequences of this can be disastrous for Russia. While Russia is slowly losing its ability to fund the war, Putin's decisions are also killing any hope of a better future for the Russian economy and its people. Before that, real quick, I have a small request. Making videos about war is a risky move on YouTube. The algorithms sometimes don't like promoting controversial stuff. So if you can just take a quick pause and hit that like button on this video, it helps me out tremendously. Thank you.
Необходимо поддержать предложение Министерства обороны и Генерального штаба о проведении в Российской Федерации частичной мобилизации.
At Russia's borders, Vladimir Putin's comeuppance, the lifeblood of his war in Ukraine, military-age men fleeing fears of conscription.
Those cars are filled with fighting-age men trying to leave Russia before they get drafted.
Russians are now fleeing to avoid Vladimir Putin's military draft, with 2 men even arriving in Alaska and requesting asylum.
On September 21st, 2022, Putin announced a partial mobilization of men in Russia, ordering 300,000 men to join the war in Ukraine. Following this announcement, many citizens have attempted to flee the country by car, train, and plane to Russia's neighboring nations. Long lines of traffic have been seen near Russia's borders with multiple neighboring countries, including Georgia, which saw a nearly 10-mile buildup of vehicles. According to Bloomberg, more than 360,000 men left the country following the announcement, and that's on top of the more than 300,000 that have already left the country after the invasion started. The total number of people that have left is hard to say, but estimates range upwards of around 1 million. These are able-bodied, working-age men, leaving a country that's already struggling with its economy. These are the exact kind of workers an economy needs to grow and get back on track. The long-term effects of this kind of exodus are drastic. When you couple in the exodus of men leaving the country to fight in Ukraine and possibly die, the majority of Russia's most productive population is not producing for the economy. Russia has no plan to fill this labor shortage in the economy, and companies are shutting down because they don't have enough manpower to stay open. Imagine being a Russian factory owner today who can't produce your goods, for which you have an excellent market, as so many Western companies have left Russia or stopped exporting to it because of a lack of manpower. Imagine being an IT firm losing engineers with no new ones in sight, or a food distribution firm losing truck drivers. Imagine being a Russian citizen unable to get the goods or services you need. This is the kind of thing that forces citizens to turn on their government. Russia is a large and powerful nation, and yet even they have their own boogeyman. What could be scary enough to scare Russia, you might ask? Well, how about a coalition of nations meant to defend against Russian advancement? In other words, NATO.
Russia has demanded that NATO should stop expanding eastwards.
Presidents of Albania and Croatia to join
NATO, threatening Russian security.
Montenegro joins NATO.
Vladimir Putin responds to NATO's expansion.
Finland and Sweden.
The leaders of the country formally announced their intention to join
NATO.
Russia's land border with NATO doubling in length.
For decades now, Russia and NATO have danced around each other, trying to seek peaceful resolutions. And now, Russia has woken up to the harsh reality of NATO's strength, a power they can no longer afford to ignore. Russia is so scared of NATO's advancements that, this year, they went to war with Ukraine over the country's decision to apply for NATO membership. Imagine that, attacking an independent democracy over the fear of what if. So now, let's take a look into what NATO really is and why Russia seems so terrified of them. So we're going to be going pretty in-depth with this video, and as the YouTube algorithm isn't always favorable to war-related topics, your likes would help in pushing this video up. Alright, let's move on. To understand why Putin fears this alliance, it's essential that we thoroughly define what NATO is and why it exists. We're gonna have to go way back for this one, so let's take a trip through history, shall we? You see, after the Second World War, the war that lasted between 1939 and 1945, the Soviet Union refused to withdraw forces from Eastern Europe. Maybe it was anger from the severe losses the Soviet Union experienced during the war, or maybe it was greed in an attempt to secure more resources. Whatever the reason, they didn't withdraw. In 1948, they then circled Berlin, Germany's capital. This forced the other world superpower, the United States, to take action in a bid to halt the advances of the Soviet Union. In this attempt to counter Soviet expansionism, NATO was founded in 1949. That was the birth of what is now Moscow's nightmare. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and when it was formed, it had 12 member countries. This included, apart from the US, Britain, France, Canada, Italy, the Netherlands, Iceland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Norway, Portugal, and Denmark. Yes, I know, they are all heavy hitters. Today, however, NATO has 30 member countries, and it is more powerful than it has ever been. The newest member state is North Macedonia, which joined in 2020. There are also 3 so-called partner countries, that is Ukraine, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, that have all declared their aspirations to become part of the alliance. This will only increase the resources and the strength of the alliance. However, this declaration of intent is part of the reason why Russian discontent exists. I'll talk about that in a moment. In essence, NATO is a military alliance, created to act as a common security policy for all member states. What I mean by that is that if a NATO member country is invaded, this will be considered an invasion of all NATO member countries. An attack on one is an attack on all. Therefore, all NATO member countries will act against the invasion. You know the drill, it's much like brothers do on the playground. NATO says its purpose is to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through political and military means. This is the key statement in the NATO pact, and it is the reason that Russia is so afraid of NATO. And this is the part specifically where Russian fear kicks in. When the Soviet Union collapsed on December 25th, 1991, about 31 years ago, 15 new countries emerged from the rubble. These are Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia. Give me a second, let me catch my breath. Okay, and then finally Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. Despite the Soviet Union's collapse, Russia, the main state that remained, has pushed a policy that has kept these separatist states on their toes. That finally started proving to be a bad strategy when those countries started joining NATO. Russian aggression pushed them into the hands of the enemy. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined NATO in 2004, further scaring Putin as Russia became further and further isolated. To understand just how bad the NATO problem is for Russia, look at the screen for a moment. This is the Soviet Union in 1990. Russia dominated the Soviet Union and 6 allied Warsaw Pact countries, giving them significant influence over regional affairs. However, the NATO boogeyman has stripped that influence quite a bit. When it was formed, the alliance was part of an effort by the US and its European allies to deter any expansion of the then Soviet Union. Additionally, it was meant to reduce the possibility of conflict on the continent by encouraging greater political integration between its powers. In the decades since, it has steadily expanded its orbit, bringing a swath of Central and Eastern European states into its ranks after the Soviet Union collapsed. It is this very situation that has troubled Moscow. Over the last 3 decades, Germany was reunified and all the former Warsaw Pact countries have joined NATO. In addition, as I mentioned before, 3 countries that were once part of the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, have joined NATO as well. This has reduced what was once a large area of influence for the Soviet Union to little more than domestic influence for Russia, the Soviets' successor state. Remember this map? Over the last decades, it has been reduced to this, a mere fraction of what it used to be. That's gotta be hard to take if you're trying to return to the glory days of the Soviet Union. The eastward expansion of NATO is what has caused a problem for Russia, as it keeps being limited in terms of its influence and power. Putin has objected to NATO expansion, saying in December of 2021, "America is at our doorstep with missiles." How would America feel if missiles are deployed at Canada or Mexico's borders? This move by NATO to keep expanding right up to Russia's doorstep is what Russia does not want. And that very factor is what led Russia to invade Ukraine in the first place. As Ukraine's interest in becoming a NATO member increased, Russia realized that if that happened, they would be totally encircled, which is unacceptable to them. Ukraine, being the second biggest Soviet successor state, means that they have quite the influence, the resources, and the manpower. And for them to be a NATO member and be right at Russia's doorstep is unacceptable, and according to Russia, just plain wrong. So strongly is this ingrained in Russian thought that it has opted to go to war with Ukraine just to prevent them from becoming a NATO member state. Russia's approach has resulted in them having tense relations with the rest of Europe, particularly to NATO. This is resulting in some pretty tense and close confrontational encounters with NATO. Let's take a look at what Russia wants, or rather is demanding of NATO in these dire circumstances. Okay, now hear me out on this one for a second. Putin is not wrong about how the alliance's growth has affected Russia's perception of its security. 30 years ago, Russia had a buffer zone of satellite states to the west. Now it only has the unimpressive presence of Belarus. Russia's western border is NATO's eastern flank. American and British military advisors serve in Ukraine. US missile defense systems sit in Poland and Romania, and NATO troops conduct exercises in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, once part of the Soviet Union. If you ask Western officials, including the leaders of those new NATO countries, they all view those measures as purely defensive. After all, Putin is not really known for being the kind of leader who makes his neighbors comfortable. In response to all of these actions, Putin has outlined his grievances and demands. What Russia wants is for NATO to stop its expansion into Eastern Europe, close to Russia. In addition to this, Putin is demanding a guarantee from NATO that Ukraine would not be given membership, a point he is adamant about. That's not all, however. Putin's list of demands continues. He wants NATO to retreat to pre-1997 status and stop the deployment of weapons in Russia's neighborhood. What Putin wants is tantamount to a smaller, weaker NATO, one that existed pre-1997. This is further supported by the fact that Russia has challenged the membership of 14 countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, an agreement that was signed in response to the formation of NATO in 1955. The pact was aimed at providing military protection to member countries. But when the Soviet Union disintegrated, the treaty followed suit. It's pretty clear that Russian demands are outrageous, and they've been refused by both the US and NATO. Jeffrey Van Orden of the Gold Institute for International Strategy wrote, "Putin has now demanded a reset and wants all NATO forces withdrawn. In effect, he wants recognition that these nations are within Moscow's sphere of influence. What is Putin really up to? He's testing Western resolve. He wants recognition of his gains in the Donbas region and Crimea, full control of the Sea of Azov coastline, domination of the Black Sea, and ultimately the return of Ukraine and other former Soviet bloc countries to Moscow's sway." It seems Putin's motives are pretty obvious, but this then leaves us with a what-if question. What if Russia did try to take over one of its fellow NATO neighbors? What would happen if Russia is forced into a confrontation with NATO? Can they take them on? Without wasting too much time on this segment, I'll give you a clear answer, and that answer is a resounding and undebatable no. Russia would be crushed by NATO, and that is why they have opted to battle Ukraine before they get a chance to join NATO. Something that is, well, seemingly not going as planned still. But that, however, is a story for another video. One country cannot compete with 30. Inclusive of some of the world's strongest and largest. Russia is simply outclassed in every possible metric. Whether it is military power or defense expenditure, there is no comparison between Russia and all of NATO. According to NATO, the combined estimated defense expenditure of all 30 member nations in 2021 was $1.2 trillion. In 2020, NATO countries spent $1.1 trillion. On the other hand, Russia only spent $61.7 billion in 2020 on defense. That difference is leaps and bounds. Russia simply cannot outspend NATO. When it comes to manpower, about 40,000 NATO soldiers are ready to fight with Russian forces at a moment's notice. On the other hand, if NATO were to engage in a war directly, they would have more than 3.3 million soldiers at their disposal. These are top troops with excellent training and the very best equipment. Russia, on the other hand, it has just about 1.2 million soldiers. The question as to whether they are properly equipped is another matter entirely. The Ukraine war has really put a large dent in the ferocious reputation that the Russian army had made for itself. For all intents and purposes, I know most of you view it as weak, or at least not as ferocious as the books made them out to seem. Russia's aggression, maybe out of fear, has only made life harder for them. Their fearful aggression towards Ukraine and the conflicts they've been having with NATO have only brought the alliance closer together. Germany has even had the resolve to block the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is being built to sell more Russian natural gas to Europe. Quite the irony, isn't it? Putin's belligerent approach is bringing his enemies closer. But that's not the only irony in this whole Ukraine-NATO mess. The thing is, NATO doesn't really want Ukraine as a member, but it doesn't want to give Putin veto power over who gets to apply. Allowing Russia to dictate limits to NATO defenses in member countries is something that is not even an option. Putin strongly believes himself to be in the right. He argues that the West has betrayed Moscow by breaking alleged verbal commitments made at the end of the Cold War that NATO would not expand eastwards. NATO denies that any such promises were made. I will not be the judge on who's lying or not, but I will say that these are interesting parallels in a game of world peace. So, this is where we are. Russia is shockingly scared of NATO and NATO's advancements. Putin's desired legacy of restoring the Soviet Union to its former glory is something that NATO will never allow. And as more of Russia's former territories and allies join NATO, the more that dream diminishes. Now, Russia has moved to attack countries before they can join NATO, because it knows that once they do join NATO, it's game over. NATO is the thorn in Putin's side, one that he cannot defeat, and one that, with time, will bring about his harsh and painful downfall. So, last video I had to blur some of the clips so YouTube doesn't demonetize and suppress the video, but I decided to upload an uncensored version too and kept it unlisted. Guess what? that video got demonetized and age restricted. It's crazy that YouTube keeps suppressing my videos, but when the big news organizations upload the same clips, nothing happens to those videos. So that's why I launched my Patreon, where viewers can support the videos and watch the uncensored versions. I have had a lot of issues with YouTube monetization and sponsors pulling out because of topics I cover, so Patreon is going to be extremely helpful in funding the channel and making it possible for me to continue covering these topics. You can check out the Patreon by clicking on the link in the description. Thank you so much. This was the Soviet Union at the height of its power.
From man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York earlier today.
12th of April, 1961, a Soviet Air Force pilot, Yuri Gagarin, became the first human to blast into space.
The Soviets became the first nation to build a nuclear power plant.
And this was the Soviet Union as it crashed and burned in 1991.
Military leaders and the Soviet secret police have taken control of the government, and now Vice President Gennady Yanayev is sitting in the president's seat.
1,000 people outside now, but the military has just announced on the evening newscast called Vremya that there's going to be a curfew in Moscow.
Why am I talking about the Soviet Union? Well, because its successor state, the Russian Federation, seems to be following the exact same model that led to the collapse of this Soviet Union. Putin has managed to make himself public enemy #1, so much so that I bet you haven't even worried about Kim Jong-un much this year, now have ya? I knew you hadn't. What's interesting is that the same factor that raised the Soviet Union to its glory seemingly looks like the catalyst that will bring down Russia. What am I talking about? Oil, my friends. Sweet, sweet oil. Oil and gas are the commodities that have Russia spiraling into a crisis. A crisis that earlier this year had the European Council president tweeting this. To understand Russia's current predicament, we need to understand what makes Russia tick. As you go through this video, you will then understand how that oil crisis has branched into an economic crisis and a foreign policy crisis. One could argue that most, if not all, of Russia's problems stem from the root of the oil and energy crisis. So let's go deeper. But before we do that, please take a second and press the like button. I've been on a journey to cover some topics skipped in mainstream news media, be it Russia, China, or anything else. That does not always sit well with the YouTube gods, so your support is greatly appreciated. Alright, now back to the Russians. You see, Russia as a state inherited a lot from the Soviet Union. The main thing that it took away was the energy dominance that the Soviet Union had, inheriting several pipelines and massive oil and gas fields that were part of the Soviet territory. This gave the state a leg up to continue dominating the energy field that the Soviets had. And since then, Russia has been dominating in the energy field globally. Many analysts have called Russia an oil company with a president who's a CEO, with former US Senator John McCain going so far as saying, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. And while that may be a bit rude to say, it is a fact that Russia's global dominance and superiority have always heavily relied on its oil and gas supply. Putin himself has referred to Russia as a global energy superpower. And this is well within his rights. Russia is a global energy force to be reckoned with. It is one of the top 3 crude producers, vying for the top spot with Saudi Arabia and the United States. In 2021, Russian crude and condensate output reached 10.5 million barrels per day, making up 14% of the world's total supply. Imagine that. 14% of global supply coming from a single country. And it's not just oil either, no, Russia has gas too. Geez, talk about having everything, right? Russia is the world's 2nd largest producer of natural gas, behind the United States, and has the world's largest gas reserves. It is also the world's largest gas exporter. A lot of this is sold to China and Europe, with Russia being Europe's main supplier. In fact, the EU depends on Russian gas for 45% of its imports and around 40% of its consumption. That means that while Europe is extremely dependent on Russia for energy, Europe is also Russia's big cash cow for money. And this is where the problems start, and the similarities to the Soviet Union start showing. Russia is simply too dependent on its oil and gas, and this leads to several problems. Despite having the resources, Russia has not taken the time to diversify its economy like the Saudis did when they struck oil. Instead, Russia's economy has just grown around oil and gas, given that they have, well, so much of it. This has created a situation where their over-reliance on fossil fuel exports puts the nation's GDP and domestic spending at risk every time oil prices drop or its exporters lose market share. Their income is always in flux depending on oil prices. So to put it simply, hydrocarbons are the centerpiece of modern Russia. No wonder the late Senator McCain called them a gas station masquerading as a country. When you look at their revenues as a nation, oil and gas make up 60% of the country's exports and 45% of its budget revenues. Take a look at this graph from Statista. It shows the share of the oil and gas industry in Russia's GDP from the first quarter of 2017 to the second quarter of 2022. Their hydrocarbon energy has ranged from 15 to 25% of the Federation's GDP. Nearly half of all that is exported to Europe, with most of the rest being sold in Asia. This comes back to what I said earlier. Europe is highly dependent on Russian supply, but Russia is too dependent on European money. I mean, how can they not be when 60% of the country's exports and 45% of the nation's budget is based on commodities? This over-reliance on just one sector is crippling Russia, and has accelerated to the point where it might just be the catalyst to Russia's collapse. One of the problems with being too dependent on the energy sector, as the Soviets learned the hard way, is that oil prices are volatile. For example, low oil prices during much of the 2010s hurt Russia's oil revenues. Hurting their revenues means hurting the nation's own plans and budgets, given how dependent they are. Other high-producing countries like the US and Saudi Arabia are also, to a degree, victims of the same challenge. But still, they have other sectors boosting their nations up, giving them vast capital to boost production even in high oil price years, something that Russia simply can't do. And let me be clear, it's not just the economic climate around oil. A good portion of Russia's oil and gas crisis stems from them just refusing to innovate. When Putin came into power in 2000, there was a boom in Russia's revenue due to oil prices spiking up. This might have been a contributing factor that led to Putin's rise in power. By the way, let me know if an in-depth documentary-type video into the rise of Putin to power and his consolidation of it would interest you. You can just comment in the comment section below if you want it. Anyway, despite all of that money available to spend, Russia did not innovate, and there were weak incentives for companies to develop new fields. To this very day, Russian oil production relies heavily on inefficient water pressure extraction in Soviet legacy reserves because of the high cost of developing new fields. Yeah, they are still using Soviet-era inherited methods. In addition to this, 2/3 of new reserves have unconventional oil that requires new technologies and large capital investment to extract. Hence the very slow growth of Russian production systems in comparison to their counterparts. Now, this is not usually a devastating catastrophe, because often you will find countries with massive resources but the incapacity to take advantage of them. In these cases, these countries just sign various contracts with foreign oil companies, as we have seen in so many cases. However, Russia is, well, different. Because of Russia's high tax rate, chaotic regulatory system, and official distrust of foreign companies, particularly from the West, there have always been barriers to collaborative exploits. This has meant that Russia has not been able to fully exploit its Siberian fields, further limiting the output and revenue that could be obtained. It's also important to note that with a sector that depends heavily on international relations and good foreign policy to foster better trade relations, Russia's situation has been murky at best. Russia's 2014 militarism in Ukraine had the effects of bringing US sanctions to their doorstep, and this crippled the country's oil revenues. Furthermore, the European Union's regulations for a move towards green energy have been eroding Russia's advantage. After all, what's the point of having vast hydrocarbon resources if the world is moving towards clean energy? In light of all these problems that have been causing quite the energy crisis in Russia, there's also the Ukraine challenge. Probably Russia's biggest mistake since the conception of the nation. Unless you've been living under a rock in some mountainous area in Tibet, you know the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Or, as Putin likes to call it, his military exercise. I wonder if military exercises normally look like this.
Russia overnight launched its long-anticipated attack on Ukraine, striking military posts across the country.
Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are fleeing the war into neighboring countries to the west.
Ukraine says Russian forces launched 70 missiles on Wednesday. 51 of them were intercepted, but those that did strike knocked out power and water service across Ukraine and killed at least 7 people.
The mistake that most people tend to make is to look at this year's invasion of Ukraine in a vacuum. It's not. It's not just a political battle either, no. There are deep economic ties that are fueled by oil and gas that make Russia's already less than pure invasion motives that much more foul. You see, of all the 15 or so states that emerged from the Soviet Union, aside from Russia, Ukraine was the one who had quite a foothold. Not only does it have a sizable population, but it also inherited oil and gas infrastructure. This is key to note, because Russia needs some of these pipelines to transport its hydrocarbons to Europe. This has meant that Ukraine has always been vital to Russian export plans. The extent of that vitality just depends on whether the current Ukrainian government is pro-Russian or pro-West. Ukraine having a pipeline hub in Ukraine that Russia depends on is something that Putin and his regime have never really been that fond of. Over the years, Ukraine has had disputes a handful of times over Russian transit fees owed for use of Ukraine's hub for exports to Europe, and thus has become a source of contention, furthering the tensions between the two countries. Ukraine's strategic role in managing the gas hub in Europe and its former geographic importance in the Soviet era means that disputes over prices have also been geopolitical. The timing of major disputes with Ukraine suggests that Putin also sought to divert the Russian public's attention from problems with its own oil-based economy. Oil revenues underwrote cheap domestic gas and other public benefits in Russia. But all it takes is a close analysis to see that the country has hit economic rough spots just before disputes with Ukraine in 2006, 2009, and 2014. Each of these disputes with Ukraine has seen Russia take harsh measures. Let's take a look at them individually. Take out your microscopes, please. In April of 2005, Putin abruptly demanded more than a threefold increase in gas prices from Ukraine. An unreasonable action, to say the least. That then resulted in Russia cutting back the gas supply to Ukraine's hub in 2006, causing 3 days of low pressure in the system that reduced flow to several European countries. In January 2009, Putin also completely cut off the supply of gas from Russia for 12 days, leaving millions of people without heat in 7 European states. EU negotiators mediated the talks. Again, Putin's timing was not random. It coincided with the low point of the 2008 financial and oil price crash, which set off a profound slump in Russia's domestic economy. 2014 perhaps had the most severe of these conflicts. After a pro-Russian president was ousted by the people, Putin's military annexed Crimea and provided arms to Russian separatists in Ukraine's Donbass region, something that was heavily criticized by the international community. Something to note is that around that time, Crimea had been known to have significant offshore gas fields. Them selling their oil and gas to Europe would undercut Russia's business by tens of billions of dollars, something that Russia obviously did not want. Now, I'm not saying they solely invaded Crimea for their gas fields, but what I'm saying is that it is quite the coincidence that they invaded the place with massive Ukrainian gas fields at a time when Ukrainian politicians were exploiting their offshore reserves as a way to phase out reliance on Russian gas imports. All this Russian aggression has not gone unnoticed or unpunished on the international platform. Not long after the 2009 gas dispute, the EU began to push back on Putin's fossil dominance with a series of regulatory and judicial actions that reduced Russia's leverage in oil and gas sales in Europe. Basically, they wanted to reduce Russia's power in the energy sector, given how good old Putin was abusing it every time he threw a temper tantrum. The EU's third energy package aimed to reduce corruption and build a framework for climate policy. One rule, known as unbundling, which basically forbids the same company to have a monopoly over both energy infrastructure and fuel, directly targeted Gazprom. This one rule saw Gazprom, Russia's largest state-owned multinational energy corporation, punished heavily. Several antitrust raids took place in September of 2011 on Gazprom's offices in 10 EU countries. Gazprom was then charged with unfair practices of demanding higher prices from vulnerable countries like Bulgaria and Poland. It also doesn't help that these countries were pro-West. Yeah, look at you, old sly Putin. Gazprom faced potential fines of up to 10 billion euro. After this, several EU countries invested in new gas infrastructure to reduce reliance on Gazprom. These changes heavily impacted Gazprom's profits, and hence, money into Russia. The EU has put in place new EU climate rules, an action that has Moscow fuming. Many of these including green measures that would effectively reduce payments and imports from Russia in favor of clean energy. In totality, these would hurt the profits of Russian aluminum and steel exports, which have high carbon footprints. Do you remember the part where I said Europe is a major Russian customer, and that the hydrocarbons account for 45% of Russia's budget? Yeah, that jeopardizes that. Combined, all of this probably fueled Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, it fueled the EU's hatred of Russia even more. Alright, well, where does this leave us? Well, the EU has heavily sanctioned all things Russian, and each member state has already begun plans to phase out Russian oil and gas. What this means is that, though it might not fully look like it now, Russia, they're in big trouble. Just because Europe is hurting from Russian pushback does not mean that Russia is not hurting as well. We're coming to a point where Russian revenues are going to be drastically reduced, and it might be forced to rely solely on Asian markets. Europe is tired of being bullied, and by invading Ukraine, Russia has committed a pretty grievous sin, one that they'll probably pay for with their economic life. In the absence of European markets, Russian revenue will decrease. This will heavily impact almost half of all of Russian budgetary income, leading to tense domestic issues. And poor old Putin can't even have any more of his normal tantrums of hiking oil prices, because now a price cap on Russian oil has been imposed by the US and its European allies to try to throttle revenues to Russia. The cap agreed upon at $60 per barrel recently is meant to be enough to give Russia an incentive to keep pumping oil, contributing to global supply, but preventing windfall profits amid its war in Ukraine. This policy allows those importing Russian oil to take advantage of Western shipping, financing, and insurance, only if they pay at or below the $60 price. Basically, Russia's teeth are being cut off. Remember the time the Soviet Union collapsed? Yeah, that looked a lot like what's happening right now. We might be coming towards a day when we see Russia being phased out and cut off from the international community. And when that begins, remember, it all started as an oil and gas crisis. Russia is running out of money. It's trying everything in its power to continue this war, but it seems like the West's actions are finally working. The price cap strategy that went into effect just 2 months ago is hurting Russia right where it hurts the most: their bank account. You see, ever since the price cap went into effect, Russia's oil revenue has been declining. This is great news for everyone, especially Ukraine. But Putin isn't about to let it go so easily. So Russia is already planning its own counterattack in this economic war. Putin announced that from February 1st, Russia will ban selling oil to any nation that follows the Western price cap. So does this mean Russia is on its last leg in this war? Is the price cap going to be the final nail in Putin's coffin? Or will Putin's counterattack revitalize the Russian offensive? Let's take a look at that in this video.
Russia overnight launched its long-anticipated attack on Ukraine.
Russian President Vladimir Putin
warning other countries that any attempt to interfere with the Russian action will lead to, quote, consequences they have never seen.
New sanctions on its central bank just today. Russians now lining up at banks only to find ATMs out of cash.
We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen.
The European Union and its partners are working to cripple Putin's ability to finance his war machine.
The European Commission talks about this oil cap.
EU price cap on Russian oil.
G7 group of nations have decided that no country should pay more than $60 a barrel.
So the Putin oil ban went into effect on February 1st. Hopefully this video is soon after that. But if you guys want to keep up with the global news on a weekly basis, be sure to sign up for my newsletter down below. 2 times a week, I pick some of the most important stories and send them directly to your inbox. That way, you're always up to date on global events. And there's no third party like YouTube deciding what news should be age-restricted and what shouldn't. So go sign up by clicking on the link in the description. And did I mention it's completely free? Alright, coming back to the video. To truly understand why the price cap was needed, we have to back up a little bit and look at how Russia is continuing this war. Don't worry, I'll keep it short. Russia attacked Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. Millions of lives were changed because of the decision of one man, Vladimir Putin. Other countries had to do something to stop this senseless violence, but they didn't want to get involved directly to avoid any escalation to a World War III, especially since Putin controls a large nuclear arsenal. So the US, the UK, the EU, Australia, and a bunch of other countries that you can see on the screen hit Russia with sanctions. Now these sanctions were broad and quick. Much like any other country in the world, Russia's economy is heavily connected and dependent on trade with other countries. So these sanctions heavily targeted Russia's ability to trade freely. In 2020, Russia exported around $330 billion worth of stuff, a big part of which consisted of oil and natural gas, as Russia is one of the biggest energy producers in the world. And on top of this, Russia also imported over $220 billion worth of stuff, including cars, microchips, computers, and so much more. As you can tell by these numbers, Russia was heavily connected to other countries. And once sanctions were announced, all this trade was either completely halted or slowed down pretty heavily. Many countries who had other sources of energy announced that they would stop buying energy from Russia. Countries in Europe who were a bit more reliant on Russian oil announced plans to phase out oil purchases from Russia. And as you guys already know, it didn't stop there. Russian reserves were frozen in foreign countries. This was money that the Russian government was holding in foreign central banks to maintain the ruble and for foreign exchange transactions. And all of a sudden, Putin had lost access to billions of dollars. Russian banks were also kicked off the SWIFT network, which is a vital part of the financial world. This meant Russian banks were now cut off from doing business with the rest of the world. Sanctions were so harsh and unexpected that Putin had to come out and announce to the world that if sanctions continue, he will be forced to use nuclear weapons. Here it is.
Тем, кто позволяет себе такие заявления в отношении России, хочу напомнить, что наша страна также располагает различными средствами поражения, а по отдельным компонентам и более современными, чем у стран НАТО. и при угрозе территориальной целостности нашей страны, для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф.
Alright, since we just mentioned some controversial war stuff, according to YouTube guidelines, this video won't be brand friendly. So if you guys can take a second to hit the like button, it lets YouTube know that this is a valuable video, and hopefully the algorithm won't kill its reach. Alright, coming back to the video. This all happened very quickly, but what was not quick was the effects of these sanctions. You see, even though those sanctions are nicknamed weapons of economic war, they are very different from actual weapons used in wars. When a missile is launched, the painful effect of it is immediate. When sanctions are dropped, the effects are very slow, and very rarely do they actually hurt the people who are making decisions. It was Putin's decision to launch this war. We've seen from videos of young Russian soldiers that some of them don't even know they are attacking Ukraine, and they were just ordered to go attack by their superiors, and they're just following orders. But sanctions that were enacted because of this war probably will never actually reach Putin. These sanctions will affect average Russians whose jobs and livelihood depend on trade. People who worked in factories or stores that were closed down because of sanctions, those are the ones suffering, not Putin. Of course, I'm not trying to say that sanctions don't work. Sanctions work very slowly when it comes to affecting people in charge, but they usually affect the average citizens first. This is why the West was always looking for creative ways to get to Putin in order to stop this war. This is why the second round of sanctions were against oligarchs and politicians. The goal of these was to hurt the people closest to Putin, in hopes that they would either turn against him or convince him to stop the war. Oligarchs' bank accounts were frozen, their yachts/jets were seized, and their assets were repossessed. It's estimated that Russian oligarchs and officials lost close to $100 billion because of these sanctions, and they were cut off from using the world as their playground. Now the plan was to just sit back and wait and hope somehow Putin is forced to stop the war. But slowly, the world realized that Putin was prepared for most of these sanctions. You see, since 2017, Putin has been building up a war chest from oil sales, and it's estimated that this war chest alone can help Russia sustain this war until the end of 2023. On top of that, as soon as the invasion was launched, oil prices shot up to the highest levels last year, and they stayed relatively high for a good part of 2022. This helped Russia generate a record amount of revenue and keep funding its economy and the war. Record oil prices and inelasticity of oil demand helped offset a lot of the drag down from the sanctions. Russia made $100 billion from fuel exports in the first 100 days after the invasion, which was up 60% from the same time in the previous year. And it made more money while exporting less oil, all thanks to the high prices. This is when the West realized that if they wanted Putin to stop the war, they had to attack where it hurts the most: Russia's oil revenue. Europe was Russia's biggest customer, so they set out a plan to phase out Russian energy purchases by December of 2022. Around the same time, G7 and Australia also passed a price cap on Russian oil to control revenue.
European Union countries have agreed to put a cap on the price of Russian oil.
Western-led price cap on Russian oil
have decided that no country should pay more than $60 a barrel.
$60 a barrel on Russian oil.
Russia, it's about to ban those countries that set price caps.
And will apply to those countries that implemented a cap on what they were willing to pay for Russian oil.
Now, the oil price cap means pretty much what the name implies. G7 and Australia wanted to cap the price at which Russia can sell its oil. This way, they can cap the profits Russia is making and hopefully end the war sooner. Now, before we get into how they enforce the price cap, let me quickly answer the question that I'm sure many of you have already been wondering. If Europe had already stopped buying Russian oil, what's the point of a price cap? I'm sure you already know this, but modern economies live on oil. So even if Europe stopped buying Russian oil, that doesn't mean other countries will too, especially India and China, because they're getting it at a sweet, sweet discount. But that's something we'll talk about in just a second. Also, we can't afford to cut off Russian oil from the market either. Russia is one of the largest oil producers in the world. Cutting them off completely could mean prices rising exponentially. That's something we definitely can't afford on top of our current inflation crisis. And that is something developing countries definitely can't afford, considering the sensitive state the global economy is in. If you've watched my videos about Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and several of these African countries, you already know the turmoil these developing nations are going through because of high inflation. Now imagine if oil prices were to triple or even quadruple at this point. It could literally spell doom for these nations and millions of their citizens. That's why G7 needed some kind of solution where Russian oil is still available in the market, but Russia isn't benefiting from the profits of these oil sales. The solution was a price cap. Enforcing the price cap has a list of challenges that I'll go over soon, but first, let's go over the importance of picking the right price for this price cap. When setting a price cap for anything, there are certain rules you have to follow to even have a shot at success. Number 1, prices can't be so low that the seller isn't even incentivized to sell the product. In Russia's case, the price for the cap can't be below what it costs to produce the oil, because at that point, Russia would just stop producing oil because they're losing money by doing it. Number 2, prices can't be so high that it's not even affecting the market. Meaning, if oil is trading around $80 a barrel, you can't set the price cap at $100 because at that point the price cap doesn't really matter. Following these 2 rules, the price cap of Russian oil was set at $60 per barrel. Based on expert estimates, it costs Russia around $40 per barrel to produce the oil, so at a $60 price cap, there is profit to be made by still producing the oil. On top of that, for the most part, Russian oil was trading above $60 per barrel, so the price cap does have some effect on the market, and it does somewhat limit Russia's ability to maximize their profits from high oil prices. Now, as I've discussed in my previous video about Russia's finances, announcing the price cap is one thing, but enforcing it at an international level is a whole different challenge. When Russia and China are doing a deal to trade oil, the West can't possibly tell China to follow their rules, especially since that relationship hasn't been so friendly recently. It's not just China either. Many other countries are happy to buy Russian oil. And remember, most of the West has already stopped buying oil from Russia. So how do you tell so many other countries to follow the price cap? This is where the power of insurance and the shipping fleet come in. So, what the Western governments have done is make it illegal for Western companies to work with Russian oil unless the price cap of $60 is confirmed. This means that Western vessels can't ship Russian oil unless they have the proper documentation to confirm that the price cap is being upheld. So, this stops Russia from using Western shipping companies. But that doesn't mean it can't just use other shipping companies, right? Wrong. You see, insurance is a very important part of the world's shipping ecosystem. You can't set sail without insurance. You can't dock at ports without insurance, and you can't enter canals without insurance. Luckily for the West, we control 99% of this shipping insurance market. So any ship, no matter what country it's from, can't get insurance unless it has proper documentation that shows the price cap is being upheld. That means even if Russia was selling oil to India or China, there's a pretty good chance it would be below the price cap. Now, the price cap started on December 3rd of last year, so I have some data on how it's doing, and then we'll go into what Russia's counter is. As soon as the price cap was announced, Putin announced that any country that agreed to the price cap will be banned from buying Russian oil starting February 1st. Which kind of doesn't really make sense, because every country that has agreed to the price cap has already stopped buying Russian oil. That's why they implemented the price cap through the shipping and insurance companies so that other countries follow it. That's like me getting banned from going to the Super Bowl and then saying that I'm never going to go to the Super Bowl. Moving on. The good news is the price cap is working. Quite well, actually. If we look at these charts, we can see Russian oil has traded below $60 a barrel for pretty much the whole time since the cap went into effect on December 3rd. Now, there were reports of Russia trying to set up its own insurance and shipping networks to continue selling its oil, but it doesn't seem like any of that has worked out yet. Worse yet, I think Putin really counted on China and India to make up the demand that had disappeared after Europe stopped buying Russian energy. But that didn't go as he expected. As I mentioned in my previous video, China and India were buying more than the usual amount of oil from Russia, and that was before the price cap. But the only reason they were doing this was because they were getting the oil at a discount when compared to the market price. Now, I have to bring back this famous geopolitics quote because it reminds me of the situation perfectly. There are no permanent friends in geopolitics, only permanent interests. China and India were buying Russian oil before because it was benefiting them. And once the price cap went into effect, they made sure they took full advantage. As the price of the Russian oil fell, there were reports that India had been buying even larger quantities at a steeper discount. Since the price cap, Russian oil export volumes are down substantially, and the price at which it's selling the oil is lower too. Considering all of this, we can safely assume that caps are working, but the West doesn't plan on stopping there. Recent reports confirm that G7 and the EU plan on setting 2 more price caps for Russian products. One is a $100 per barrel cap on products that trade at a premium to crude, like diesel, and the other is a $45 cap for petroleum products like fuel oil and industrial lubricant oil. Analysts believe this will further cause market disruption and hurt Russia even more.